Well, here. Well, we now introduce Patricia Ramsey, Sister Patricia Ramsey. I will make your presentation, Sister Patricia, in Spanish. Don't you mind?
No, continue.
No?
That's
Okay.
fine. Yeah.
Thank
Yes.
you. Bien, para los que no la conocen, la hermana Patricia Ramsey es una hermana clarisa y sirve a su comunidad como abadesa en el monasterio de Londres, en Reino Unido. Obtuvo un máster en teología sobre cristianismo celta y un doctorado en teología por la Universidad de Gales, Lampeter. Su tesis doctoral, Sacred Time in Early Christian Ireland, fue publicada por T&T Clarke en 2007. Ella continúa investigando sobre los primeros textos litúrgicos irlandeses. Ha recibido una licencia postdoctoral para realizar una investigación sobre los tempranos martirologios irlandeses. Su investigación sobre los primeros textos cristianos abarca la vida de las mujeres y sus expresiones religiosas a través de los siglos y ha resultado en la publicación de Women of the Church, The Religious Experience of Monastic Women, esto del año 2011, y otro texto, Lest She Pollute the Sanctuary, The Influence of the Protevangelium Jacobi on Women's Status in Christianity. Este es del año pasado, de 2020. Actualmente se encuentra preparando un nuevo libro y es Honorary Associate Professor de la Universidad de Nottingham, en Reino Unido, y es miembro también del equipo editorial de Studia Traditionis Theologiae. Así que le damos la bienvenida. We welcome you, Sister Patricia.
Thank you.
Our representatives of St. Clair here, and it's a great pleasure to hear you. I don't know if you need to share a PowerPoint.
No, it's straightforward paper.
Okay. I let you then.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference, which is a great privilege, which I'm aware of. The title of this paper is Mulier quid ploras hodie? Woman, why are you weeping today? On Easter morning, so the story goes, the women went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus, but their ministry was not needed. He was no longer there. At least one of them, Mary Magdalene, was in tears, weeping and grieving because the offerings she'd brought were not needed. Today, 2,000 years later, women in the church are still grieving because they're being told that their offerings, their ministry, their own specific gifts are not needed. Their particularly feminine expertise and talents, their time, their service, their ministry, their generosity are being ignored and they feel rejected. Not as on that first Easter morning because Christ has risen and the offerings are no longer relevant, but because they're women and so they're not as acceptable in Christian ministry as men are. So my paper would like to explore the reason for this distressing situation. And it shows that the causes of this grief can be traced back through the centuries to a little known text, which, though not welcomed by the church, and at one time apparently even condemned by papal authority, has become more influential in Christian theology, liturgy, and private devotion than any other text outside the New Testament. This text is the Protevangelium Jacobi, the Gospel of James, a work from probably the 2nd century, originating most likely in Syria, which gives a highly imaginative, sometimes bizarre account of the early life of Mary, her conception, birth, presentation in the temple, her betrothal to Joseph, and then her subsequent conception and bearing of Jesus. And it embellishes the gospel account with many, very many eccentric details. So the focus of this paper is to explore the influence this text has had on the status of women in the church, which has been mediated by means of the liturgy and by artifacts of various kinds, and also the effect it's had on Christian theology. Many commentators believe that the aim of this unknown author was to exalt and praise the status of Mary. If this was so, he, and we presume he was male, has failed unequivocally, and instead, by raising Mary to impossible heights of glory, placing her on an unattainable pedestal, he's removed her from this real world and made her an example so exalted that, regrettably, it's all but impossible for flesh and blood women to imitate her. And by the exaggerated emphasis this short text gives to her purity, both physical, moral, sexual, and ritual, and her virginity, antepartum, in partu, and postpartum, it has changed the status of women in the Christian movement from the original equality with men, as we find it in the Gospels, to one of subservience and compliance, and has so destroyed the gender balance observable in the earliest days of the church. There are at least 167 extant witnesses to the Greek original of the Protevangelium of James. We can see from this sheer number how immensely popular that text was in the early church. It was soon being translated from this original Greek, being read in the vernacular in Syria, Egypt, Ethiopia, Georgia, the Slavic countries, Arabia, Armenia, and right across Europe, eventually reaching as far west as Ireland. We also see confirmed from remaining artifacts such as icons, sculptures, ivories, frescoes, carved crosses, miniatures, books of hours, textiles, and manuscripts that the influence of the Gospel of James had spread in the West as far as the Atlantic coast, in the East, possibly to the banks of the Euphrates, certainly from the remote lands of Russia in the north, to the sands of Egypt, and further to the mountains of Ethiopia in the south. Today, it's widely seen as the most influential non-canonical text in the history of the church, and it's not only helped to shape the belief of the faithful, but also to spread those beliefs by means of art and literature. This is largely because of the elevated status this text has given to Mary, which has in its turn profoundly affected so many areas of Christian faith. It's through the incorporation of the various supposed events in the life of Mary into liturgical worship that the Gospel of James has communicated its understanding of Mary to the Christian world, and it is the influence of that understanding, particularly on the position of women, that interests us now. How has this text influenced the vexed issue of the ordination of women to the presbyterate and caused such grief to so many women? From the written gospel accounts, as we have them, Jesus apparently had nothing to say about the value of virginity for women. We see him accepting the women who appear in the gospel narratives. He accepted them warmly without questioning their sexual status. And he certainly didn't insist that the women who followed him adopt a celibate way of life. He seems to have shared openly both his table fellowship and his teaching with women, and this included sinners and prostitutes, to the shock and disapproval of his critics. Now, this issue of food and table fellowship reveals another aspect of the text. In the Protevangelium Jacobi, Mary is presented as eating alone in the solitude of the temple, where she's brought the exclusive food of angels, thus suggesting that the authors see society from the viewpoint of extreme ritual purity and rigid exclusion based on the transgressing of the laws upholding this ritual purity. But this is in complete contrast to the gospel, where Jesus' table fellowship is open to all. He preaches a message of God's inclusive love and compassion, not one of exclusion on grounds of ritual impurity. And he is repeatedly criticized by his opponents for eating with unwashed hands and other ritual transgressions of the law. However, as the interest in Mary began to spread throughout the early Christian world, and it was fueled largely by the popularity of the Gospel of James, she was held up as the ideal for all women, whatever their marital status. And as the monastic movement gained in intensity, developing from its spontaneous and very humble beginnings, when women lived secluded and virginal lives in their own homes, concentrating on fasting, prayer, and studying the scriptures, Mary gradually came to be upheld as the exemplar for the monastic woman par excellence, especially in her life of seclusion, living exclusively enclosed within the temple, and also for her virginity, which rapidly became the defining criterion of female holiness. So through the writings, first of the fathers and the teachers of the church, then successive councils, and then later on papal decrees, this became the required pattern for women religious. According to the account this text gives of the early life of Mary, the principles on which the Gospel of James is based are those of divine election, heavenly favor, separation, and the overwhelming importance of ritual purity, especially of virginity. All values which run completely counter to the good news as it was preached by Jesus. We see in the New Testament that the God whom Jesus reveals as Father does not encourage elitism or exclusion. All are equally his children, and all are welcome in his kingdom. But the Protevangelium Jacobi has perpetuated an Old Testament attitude towards society, that of divine election and discrimination based on ritual purity, especially for women. But even as early as the 5th century, the idea that virginity was a superior and even a preferable way of life to marriage was controversial. Although their teaching was eventually condemned, both Helvidius and Jovinian held the view that this elitism in the name of asceticism endangered an authentic understanding of the nature of the church, where its holiness was shared by all the members. They also regarded this devaluation of marriage as resting on a defective, unsound, and ultimately heretical view of created reality. And they both regarded these ascetic tendencies as reflected in the negative presentation of Mary's virginity. Helvidius saw the teaching of Mary's postpartum virginity as narrowing the possibilities of holiness, and Jovinian regarded the in partu virginity of Mary as expressing disdain for creation and the material world. Their views, although they were supported by many, they were not accepted by the mainstream church. And then the Gospel of James has influenced the liturgical worship of the church. Popular feasts were instituted based on its stories, which, although their origin had maybe been for various other reasons, like that of the celebration of the presentation of Mary in the temple, which was originally to celebrate the dedication of the church to Mary, they became eventually seen as commemorating events or people described in the text, and these feasts eventually spread from the east to the west. So in this way, the Gospel of James has influenced liturgical prayer by adding these imaginary Marian feasts to the yearly festal cycle, and the theological ideas which we identify in the Gospel of James were being spread throughout the church by means of these various feasts, in spite of the fact that the text itself seems to have been regarded with disfavor by the Gelasian decretal and by many doctors and teachers in the church. The widespread distribution, both of so many translations of the text into different languages, and these artifacts which illustrate its various scenes, bear witness to the influence exerted by the Gospel of James, both in the aspect of time throughout the centuries and in the aspect of place right across the then known Christian world. So, as the research for my recent book has clearly demonstrated, in its emphasis on the ritual defilement of women's menstrual uncleanness, which even was seen as affecting someone as pure as Mary, and so of her consequent exclusion from the temple, the Gospel of James has had a negative influence regarding the possibility of women's ordination to the diaconate, the presbyterate, or any position of leadership in the church. This is clearly at odds with the situation which we find in Paul's letters, where women are active and influential in leadership and ministry. We only have to look at chapter 16 of Paul's letter to the Romans, where so many women are mentioned by name and actually praised warmly for the assistance that they've given him. Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza bluntly states, evidence for that leadership has been largely and intentionally suppressed. So, by removing Mary from the temple when she reached puberty and regarding her as potentially able to pollute the temple by her impending womanhood, the Gospel of James has had a deleterious effect on the place of women in the church and has denied their fitness to exercise any public ministry. This has resulted explicitly in the banishment of women from the sanctuary in those Christian denominations which hold the Protevangelium Jacobi in highest regard, while the importance given to virginity and sexual purity has resulted in an unbalanced and negative attitude to humanity, to physicality, and to sexuality, which has demeaned women by making a physical condition, virginity, more important than following the gospel. If we look at the breviary, women in Christian liturgy and theology are categorized according to their sexual status. They're either virgin or holy woman, but men have never been classified in such a demeaning manner. Ronald Hock, one of the current translators and commentators on the Gospel of James, assesses it as an encomium. If he's right in this assessment, then in actual fact, the author has done just the opposite. In his efforts to glorify Mary and to increase the honor and reverence paid to her, especially because of her total and perpetual virginity, her life set apart in the temple from her early years, her miraculous motherhood, her complete and self-effacing obedience, in actual fact, he has removed her from the world of living women and placed her on such an exclusively lofty pedestal that it's impossible for women to emulate the goddess model which she presents. And in the author's effort to remove Mary from the sacred precincts of the temple before she can pollute or defile the holy place by attaining womanhood, he completely removes her from the world of living women, and so removes from women themselves the possibility of presbyteral ordination, because that same womanhood has now become something shameful, polluting and degrading, something which precludes them from entering a holy place. Marina Warner rightly comments, a dualistic distaste for the material world reinforces the ideal of virginity, and an undiminished certainty that women are subordinate to men continues to make the priesthood of women unacceptable. In this way, she shows the connection between the negative, life-denying stance of the Gospel of James and the unacceptability of women's ordination. Joanne McNamara reinforces this with her comment, the natural pollution of the female body rendered women ineligible to participate in the sacrifice of the altar. So this text has exalted virginity to an unreal degree, thus affecting the lives of countless women. These effects which the Gospel of James has had on the lives of women are quite serious enough, but they could be seen as directly affecting only half the human race. However, the theological principles which underpin this text have even more far-reaching consequences. In its aversion to a real and genuine humanity for Mary, it brings into question the reality of the incarnation. While some commentators have seen the Gospel of James as simply attempting to glorify Mary, others have regarded the text as Christological rather than Mariological in its focus. But if this is true, that this text introduces a denial of the genuineness of Christ's incarnation by asserting a dichotomy between the human and the divine, where what is human, natural, bodily is seen to be bad, while what is spiritual, supernatural, disembodied is understood to be good and holy. This is perhaps the most adverse and detrimental theological effect the Protevangelium Jacobi has had both on the lives of women and on men. In this paper, based on research for my own recent work, I've explored this second century text and its abiding influence on the church, especially on the place of women, with regard to their potential ordination in the Roman Church, and on some of the basic doctrines of Christianity, specifically the Incarnation. And although it was certainly not solely responsible for the initiation and dissemination of these ideas, because there were potent sociological and cultural factors also at work, but because of its sheer popularity, its widespread effects, particularly liturgical and artistic, have spread throughout the Christian world, taking with them the negative, world-denying theology on which they were based. We see how the Protevangelium Jacobi influenced the beliefs of early Christians, and how so many of those negative beliefs have survived the centuries, and they are still with us today, still exercising a pernicious influence on the lives of women and causing them much grief. Mulieres, quid plurastis hodie. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sister Patricia. Really moving and really a new interpretation of the Gospel of James. I enjoyed very much, and I think our audience too. So if you want, we have some questions. If someone wants to ask Sister Patricia, si alguien quiere preguntar, abrimos el espacio. Si quieren en el chat o pueden habilitar el micrófono y preguntarle. Sister Patricia, do you understand Spanish? No. Well, so I translate if necessary.
Thank you.
Mariano, sí.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sister. Just a comment, because I think it's really, really interesting to try to nuance some presentations that we have yesterday about the equality between men and women. For instance, the communication about Hieronymus. So I think that your paper was really, really illuminating, because it's in order with that I try to prove in my presentation that we have in the first centuries I try to think differently about the place of woman and gender in the first times of Christianity, but we found a different current that finally imposed like orthodoxy today. So I think your just a comment, your paper was really, really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's interesting that the churches, the denominations which give most honor and credence to the Gospel of James, that is particularly Orthodoxy, but also Catholicism, are the two churches which are most adamantly against women's ordination. I think that says a lot, I think.
Yeah.
And it's also, as you say, what was happening in the first century, the attitude which is creeping into Paul's letters is already overriding what we see in the gospel as Jesus' attitude to women, which was, I think, because we're so familiar with the gospel, so familiar with the gospel stories, it doesn't hit us hard enough just how revolutionary Jesus' attitude to women actually was. He spoke to them in public, which you just didn't do, a rabbi did not do. And it says he loved women, for goodness sake, you know. But by Paul's later letters, we see it coming in, women are gradually being sidelined. And then, of course, once we get into the era of the fathers of the church, women are something not to be trusted. They don't have a good effect on men.
That's right. Even I think on the contradiction of Jesus being touched by a woman with the flood of blood, and this fear of in the Gospel of James of Mary polluting the sanctuary, you know, and this. But I think without thinking that the influence of the Gospel of James was great, really. There's, for example, a moment in chapter 17 where Mary appears even as a prophetess, no? When she sees two peoples and she laughs and she's sad. Mary's many things for Protevangelium Jacobi. So, anyone else? ¿Alguna pregunta más? ¿Algo? ¿Intervenciones? Sister Patricia, just one last question, a bit uniting your condition as poor Claire. What do you think Claire did for this situation of women? You think that Claire in the Middle Ages, no, it is presented something new? What briefly? What do you think?
I think Claire presented something totally new. As I'm sure you know, she was the first woman in the history of the church to write a rule for women, which was a big enough thing. Before Claire's time, enclosure was more or less taken for granted, following the example of Mary in the temple. Claire sees enclosure more as a filter for keeping out distractions rather than for keeping the world at arm's length, which is what it became. I think her attitude to the place of women, how women lived religious life, was something totally new in the church, totally new, that perhaps, again, got lost through the centuries, because poor Claire's, like all monastic women, from the time of Boniface VIII and his decree periculoso, enclosure became absolutely obligatory. But there's plenty of evidence that the nuns didn't take this too kindly, and right throughout the Middle Ages, bishops were constantly trying to keep nuns within their monasteries, and the nuns were not being very cooperative. So it's always been an issue, I think.
Yeah, it's true, and it's keeping great attention. It's rediscovering. It's a rediscovering of Claire's figure and his deeds, his political matters. No, she lives in her monastery, but she dialogues with the Pope and fights for her kind of her style, her rule. That's really interesting. So, well, we profit that you are a Paul Claire to ask this. It's an amazing woman of Middle Ages. Sister Patricia, thank you very much. It's an honor to have you here. Ha sido un honor tenerte con nosotros, que compartieras tu tiempo y que te interesaras por las jornadas. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great honor to speak. I really do appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.